The Carter family reunion was always the biggest event of the year. Every summer, relatives traveled from across the country to gather at the family lake resort, a sprawling property that had belonged to the Carters for generations. Laughter echoed across the lawns, children ran between picnic tables, and old family stories filled the air. For most people, it was a joyful tradition. For Ethan Carter, it was something he approached with caution. At 32, Ethan had learned that family gatherings often left him feeling smaller than when he arrived. Still, he came every year, hoping things would be different, hoping his father might finally see him for who he was. As Ethan parked his modest sedan beside a row of luxury vehicles, he noticed his younger brother Blake's brand. New sports car immediately. Several relatives were already gathered around it, admiring its sleek design. There he is, Uncle Dave shouted as Ethan approached. Ethan smiled politely and shook hands with a few cousins. Then he heard the familiar voice, "Well, look who finally made it." His father, Richard Carter, stepped forward with a grin that Ethan knew all too well. The schoolteacher arrives, Richard announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I was worried gas prices might have been too much for that little salary." Several relatives laughed. Ethan forced a smile. "Good to see you too, Dad." Richard slapped him on the shoulder. "I'm just joking. You know that." But Ethan knew better. The jokes never stopped. As the afternoon continued, every conversation somehow turned into a comparison between Ethan and Blake. When Ethan mentioned helping one of his students earn a college scholarship, Richard shrugged. "That's nice." Meanwhile, Blake closed a real estate deal worth more than most people make in 10 years. When a cousin complimented Ethan's dedication to teaching, Richard interrupted. "Dedication is what people call it when they're not making money." More laughter followed. Across the yard, Blake stood smiling comfortably, accepting praise as if it were his birthright. Ethan didn't blame his brother entirely. Blake had simply grown accustomed to being the favorite, the golden child, the successful son, the one who could do no wrong. As evening approached, everyone gathered near the lakeside pavilion for dinner. Strings of lights glowed overhead as family members filled long wooden tables. Ethan sat quietly near the end of one row, hoping to avoid attention. Then Richard stood and tapped a glass. The crowd gradually fell silent. "I have an announcement," he said proudly. Excitement spread through the room. Richard motioned for Blake to stand beside him. "As many of you know, our family lake house has been part of the Carter legacy for decades." Everyone nodded. The massive waterfront mansion was more than a house. It was the heart of the family. "My wife and I have decided it's time to pass it on." A murmur moved through the crowd. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. He had never expected ownership of the property, but part of him had always believed it would remain something shared by the family. Richard smiled broadly. "I'm proud to announce that the house now belongs to Blake." The pavilion erupted in applause. Blake looked shocked for a moment before breaking into a huge smile. Richard raised his hand for silence. Some people earn opportunities. Others spend their lives settling for average. Ethan immediately knew where this was going. Richard glanced directly at him. Blake took risks. Blake built wealth. Blake proved himself. That's why he's receiving $1 too. $5 million property. The crowd grew awkwardly quiet. "And Ethan," Richard continued, "well, not everyone is meant for greatness." The words landed like a punch. A few relatives looked uncomfortable. Others avoided eye contact. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended him. Ethan felt dozens of eyes on him. His face burned with embarrassment. For a moment, he thought he might say something. Instead, he stood quietly. "Congratulations, Blake," he said softly. Then he turned and walked away from the pavilion. Behind him, conversations slowly resumed. No one followed. No one except one person. From a distant table 82. year, old Grandpa Walter watched his grandson disappear into the darkness. His expression wasn't angry, it was disappointed, and for the first time in many years, Grandpa Walter began making plans. The drive home felt longer than ever. Ethan gripped the steering wheel as the dark highway stretched endlessly before him. His father's words replayed in his mind over and over. Not everyone is meant for greatness. The sentence hurt far more than losing any chance at the lake house. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the mansion itself. It was about spending his entire life trying to earn his father's respect and realizing that no achievement would ever be enough. By the time Ethan reached his apartment, exhaustion had replaced anger. He tossed his keys onto the kitchen counter and sat alone in silence. The next few weeks passed slowly. He returned to teaching summer enrichment classes and focused on helping his students prepare for the upcoming school year. The classroom became his refuge. His students didn't care how much money he made. They didn't compare him to anyone else. They appreciated him. One afternoon, a student named Maria handed him a thank you card before leaving class. "You helped me believe I could get into college," she said. Ethan smiled warmly. Moments like that reminded him why he chose teaching in the first place. Yet despite trying to move forward, news from the family kept finding him. Social media was filled with photos of Blake standing proudly in front of the lake mansion. Blake posted pictures of expensive renovations, luxury furniture deliveries, and plans for private parties. Richard shared every post. "My son is taking our family legacy to the next level." One caption read. Ethan eventually stopped looking. Then, 3 weeks after the reunion, his phone rang. The caller ID surprised him. "Grandpa Walter." Ethan immediately answered. "Grandpa." "Hello, Ethan." The elderly man's voice sounded calm but serious. "Do you have time to visit tomorrow?" "Of course. I'd appreciate that." The call ended after only a few minutes, but something felt different. The next morning, Ethan drove to Walter's countryside home. Unlike the lavish mansion Blake now occupied, Walter's house was simple and comfortable. The old man had lived there for nearly 40 years. When Ethan arrived, Walter was sitting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee already prepared. "Good timing," Walter said with a smile. Ethan sat beside him. For several minutes, neither spoke. The quiet felt peaceful. Finally, Walter broke the silence. "That reunion bothered you?" Ethan laughed softly. A little. The old man raised an eyebrow. Ethan sighed. "More than a little." Walter nodded. "I figured." For a moment, he stared across the fields. Then he said something Ethan never expected. "Your father embarrassed himself that day." Ethan looked up in surprise. Walter continued. "Not you, him." The words hit Ethan harder than he anticipated. No one in the family had ever challenged Richard. "No one." Walter leaned forward. "Do you know why I asked you here?" Ethan shook his head. "Because I need you to understand something." The old man's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Your father believes wealth measures a person's worth." He pointed toward Ethan. "I don't." A lump formed in Ethan's throat. Walter continued. "For years, you've driven me to appointments. You're my grandfather. You've repaired things around this house. You needed help. You visited me when nobody else did." Ethan remained silent. Walter smiled sadly. "Do you know how many times Blake visited me last year?" Ethan shook his head. "Once." The answer surprised him. "Do you know how many times your father called?" Again, Ethan shook his head. "Twice." Walter let the number settle. Then his expression hardened. "After that reunion, I started reviewing certain family documents." Ethan frowned. "What kind of documents?" Walter stood slowly and walked inside. A few moments later, he returned carrying a thick folder. He placed it on the table between them. Old trust agreements, property records, legal documents. Ethan stared at the stack. What is all this? Walter's eyes locked onto his grandson's. The truth. A chill ran through Ethan. Walter lowered his voice. Your father and brother think the story ended at the reunion. He gently tapped the folder. They're wrong. For the first time since that painful night, Ethan saw something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. And as Grandpa Walter opened the folder, he revealed the first piece of a family secret that had been hidden for decades. Ethan stared at the thick folder spread across Grandpa Walter's kitchen table. Old documents, legal records, trust agreements, and handwritten notes filled page after page. Some papers were decades old, their edges yellowed with age. What exactly am I looking at? Ethan asked. Walter adjusted his glasses and carefully opened one of the files. Something your father should have read before making that announcement. Ethan leaned closer. Walter pointed to a paragraph highlighted in yellow. This family trust was created by your great-grandfather in 1978. Ethan scanned the page. The legal language was complicated, but one sentence stood out. No transfer of the lakeside property could become permanent without the approval of the trust's acting chairman. Ethan looked up. Who's the acting chairman? Walter smiled. I am. For a moment, Ethan simply blinked. What? The house technically belongs to the Carter Family Trust, not your father personally. Ethan sat back in disbelief. Then how could Dad give it to Blake? He assumed he could. Walter's expression darkened, and nobody bothered to verify it. The realization sent a wave of shock through Ethan. Everything Richard had done at the reunion had been based on authority he never fully possessed. Walter continued reviewing documents. That's not the only problem. He slid another file across the table. Inside were financial reports connected to Blake's businesses. At first glance, they looked impressive. Millions in investments, multiple properties, luxury assets. Then Ethan noticed something else. Large debts, several overdue loans, declining cash reserves, risky investments. The deeper he looked, the worse it became. Blake is in trouble financially. Walter nodded, much deeper than most people realize. Ethan looked stunned. But everyone thinks he's incredibly successful, because that's what he wants them to believe. Walter folded his hands. Your brother isn't interested in preserving that mansion. He isn't, no. The old man sighed heavily. He planned to leverage the property to secure additional financing. Ethan frowned. You mean use it as collateral? Exactly. The room fell silent. For years, the Lake Mansion had been considered sacred family property. Generations of Carters had celebrated birthdays, weddings, anniversaries, and holidays there. The thought of risking it for business deals felt almost unforgivable. Walter's disappointment was obvious. They saw a legacy. He shook his head. Blake saw an asset. Over the following weeks, Walter continued gathering information. Quietly, carefully. Meanwhile, Richard and Blake remained completely unaware. In fact, they became more arrogant than ever. Blake hosted extravagant parties at the mansion. Richard proudly introduced him as the future head of the Carter family. Relatives continued praising them both. Eventually, invitations arrived for another family gathering. This time, it was officially a celebration of Blake's ownership of the estate. When Ethan received the invitation, he had no intention of attending. But Walter insisted, you need to be there. Ethan hesitated. Why? A small smile appeared on Walter's face. Because some lessons are best taught publicly. The evening of the gathering arrived. The mansion sparkled with expensive decorations. Luxury cars lined the driveway. Inside, family members mingled while praising Blake's renovation plans. Richard looked happier than Ethan had ever seen him. The moment Ethan entered, He felt the familiar tension. A few relatives greeted him politely. Most ignored him. At the center of the room, Richard stood beside Blake, raising a glass to the future of the Carter family. Cheers erupted. Then the front doors opened. The room immediately quieted. Grandpa Walter had arrived. The 82-year-old man walked slowly but confidently into the center of the gathering. Under one arm sat a large leather folder, the same folder Ethan had seen weeks earlier. Richard forced a smile. "Dad, glad you made it." Walter didn't smile back. Instead, he placed the folder on a nearby table. The sound echoed through the room. Conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward him. Walter looked around carefully. Then he spoke. "I've spent the last month reviewing our family's affairs." A sudden tension filled the room. Richard's smile faded. Blake's confidence wavered, and for the first time, both men looked nervous because they were beginning to realize that Grandpa Walter hadn't come to celebrate. He had come to reveal the truth. The room had never been so quiet. Dozens of Carter family members stood frozen inside the grand lakeside mansion as Grandpa Walter rested both hands on the leather folder before him. Richard forced a nervous laugh. "Dad, what exactly is this about?" Walter slowly looked at his son. For a moment, the disappointment in his eyes seemed heavier than any anger. "It's about truth." The words echoed across the room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Walter opened the folder and carefully removed several documents. "For years," he began, "I've watched this family measure people by the wrong standards." His gaze shifted toward Blake, money, then toward Richard, status. Finally, he looked at Ethan and public approval. The room remained silent. Walter lifted one document. "Richard, when you publicly gifted this mansion to Blake at the reunion, you claimed ownership gave you the authority to transfer it." Richard nodded cautiously. "Because it does, no." Walter's answer came instantly. The word landed like a hammer. Richard's face tightened. Walter raised the trust agreement for everyone to see. "The lakeside estate belongs to the Carter Family Trust." Murmurs spread throughout the room. Several relatives exchanged confused looks. Walter continued, "As acting chairman of that trust, I possess final approval authority over any ownership transfer." Richard's confidence completely vanished. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your transfer was never legally completed." The room exploded with whispers. Blake's face turned pale. "That's impossible." Walter calmly handed copies of the documents to several relatives. "It is entirely possible." One by one, family members began reading. Shock quickly replaced excitement. The legal language was clear. Richard had announced ownership before securing proper authorization. The mansion never officially belonged to Blake. The celebration they were attending had been built on an illusion. Blake stepped forward. "You can't do this." Walter's eyes narrowed. "No. What I can't do is allow generations of family history to be risked for personal greed." Blake froze. The room turned toward him. Walter opened another file. "This contains records of multiple loan applications tied to future plans for this property." Blake's expression collapsed. Richard looked stunned. "What loans?" Walter slowly handed him the papers. As Richard reviewed the documents, his face lost all color. Several relatives gasped. Others stared openly at Blake. The evidence showed plans to use the mansion as collateral for aggressive business investments. If those investments failed, the family's most treasured property could be lost forever. The room erupted with angry voices. "You were going to risk the house. Grandma loved this place. How could you even consider that?" For the first time in years, Blake had no answers. Walter raised one hand. The room immediately fell silent. Then he delivered the speech nobody would ever forget. "True success isn't measured by bank accounts." He looked directly at Richard. "It isn't measured by luxury cars." Then at Blake. It isn't measured by expensive houses. Finally, he turned toward Ethan. It's measured by character. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Walter smiled warmly. For years, one grandson visited me when nobody was watching. The room looked toward Ethan. One grandson helped me when he expected nothing in return. Several relatives lowered their eyes. One grandson understood that family is a responsibility, not an opportunity. Tears filled Ethan's eyes. Walter reached into the folder one final time. I have amended the family trust. The room held its breath. The mansion will remain protected as a Carter family legacy property. A wave of relief spread through the crowd. It will never belong to one individual. Then came the final surprise. Ethan will serve as trustee and caretaker of the estate. Gasps filled the room. Richard stared in disbelief. Blake looked completely defeated. But why him? Richard asked. Walter's answer was immediate. Because he's the only one who earned my trust. Silence followed, heavy, absolute, final. Then Walter looked directly at his son and grandson and delivered the sentence that ended every argument. You spent years measuring people by money. I measured them by character. Neither Richard nor Blake could respond. Neither could anyone else. At that moment, the family finally saw what Grandpa Walter had known all along. The richest person in the room had never been the one with the most money. It had been Ethan.